Alright. So March 14th, 2017, Rachel Madcow, tweets out that she got a hold of Trump's 2005 tax returns. And instead of being some breaking news, it turns into being some epic fail by her. Because you come to find out that Trump paid higher tax rate of 25% than MSNBC Comcast at 24%, and much higher than Obama at 19%, and Bernie at 13%. But I guess Bernie doesn't know.
When you're white, you don't know what it's like to be living in a ghetto. You don't know what it's like to be poor.
So Twitter goes wild over this information, wondering exactly how the left is finally gonna burn Donald Trump. Maybe the Russians get his tax returns for him. So she does this show, and then I guess she waits till like the last 19 minutes or like the end of the show to finally bring out this tax return that means absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of things. And the funny thing about it, that she had the copy the filer gets, so I'm just wondering if Trump was just trolling her anyway. But overall, it just says he paid $38 million on $150 million worth of income for 2005. But I think it's a real teachable moment to actually see the origin of the IRS, because people are so quick to point out about how these rich people aren't paying their taxes, like that somehow takes away from what you earn because rich people aren't paying their taxes. Never mentioning the amount of people that are on the government tip and welfare and disability and food stamps. And it's not the government, it's the people that pay the taxes. And the one that most complain are the people that don't pay the taxes. I mean, when I file my taxes, I'm not sitting there trying to pay the government its due. How much government waste goes on? How much in debt do they go to every year? Obama added $10 trillion to the debt, and you think any of this taxation is going to help any of that? We're not even starting with the unconstitutional Obamacare, where it actually forces you to buy a product. Health insurance forces you to buy health insurance, no matter if you want it, need it, or what. Most sick law ever created besides the income tax, the IRS, and the Federal Reserve Bank, which is neither federal or have any reserves. So I thought it would be a teachable moment right now to check out the origins of the IRS, to bring some sanity into this argument of how much people should pay the slave master out of their production and hard work. I'm sorry, forced to pay. So let's run through this a little bit. Every year, the Federal Reserve Bank and IRS take billions of dollars from the pockets of hardworking Americans with the threat of imprisonment and personal ruin. The special interests that control these institutions have used misleading information, complex laws, and intimidation to scare us into paying these income taxes. It took several generations to get us into this mess. It has become institutionalized to make us think that we have to pay income taxes to the federal government, and that's completely false. We have been programmed throughout these generations by the money interest to enslave our children and our grandchildren to enrich these banksters. Many of people in the past have spoken out against this fraud. One example is Wright Patman, who was the chairman of the House Banking Committee in 1967, and he said, "In the United States today, we have, in effect, two governments. We have a duly constituted government. Then we have an independent, uncontrolled, and uncoordinated government in the Federal Reserve System, operating the money powers which are reserved to the Congress by the Constitution." Despite people in the past and people like Rand Paul attempt to audit the Fed, it has never been audited, and any attempt to do so meets with great resistance. As I mentioned earlier, the Federal Reserve is not a government agency. It is a private, for-profit institution. It was founded in 1913 by J.P. Morgan, Mayer A. Rothschild and Company, and Paul Warburg, and others. And the Rothschild family were instrumental in creating the First National Bank of the United States, another private banking corporation. that was abolished by President Andrew Jackson. And I have noted, interesting enough, that is one of the statues that President Trump keeps in the Oval Office. So I wonder where his head's at on that. Baron M.A. Rothschild said in the 18th century, "Give me the control over a nation's currency and I care not who makes the law." Paul Warburg was a German-born financier that immigrated to the United States. The history of this man is very rich if you want to get into that or look it up. Was basically the mastermind of creating the Federal Reserve Bank and ran the bank until World War II. And his brother Max was running German finances under the Führer, Adolf Hitler. J.P. Morgan, another founder of the Federal Reserve, is believed to have used his wealth to engineer the financial panic of 1907. They have gotten away with this fraud called the Federal Reserve since 1913, when President Woodrow Wilson is said to have unwittingly signed the Federal Reserve Act. In that same year, the Secretary of State Philander Knott announced that enough states have voted in favor of the 16th Amendment to allow it to be adopted as part of our Constitution. The 16th Amendment states that Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. And it has come out throughout the years that only a few states had voted in favor of the amendment, and certainly not enough to make it law or part of the Constitution. But it was adopted anyway, through lies and deceit. But the banksters wanted more, and we ended up into World War I and World War II. And by 1933, they had intimidated or bought off enough members of the government to get their collection arm, the Internal Revenue Service. The gangster banksters finally had a monopoly to collect income taxes from the American people. The IRS administered the collection of a progressive and graduated income tax. And for you history buffs out there, I'm sure it kind of sounds a little familiar, huh? Maybe like the second plank of the Communist Manifesto? A heavy, progressive, or graduated income tax? With these Democrats running around and these liberals running around today accusing Trump left and right of being in league with the Russians, even though they're not even communists, like the boogeyman under the bed. Or the clown in the woods. That they are so close to socialist, communists, and we have basically a communist manifesto running our country. Let me see if this sounds familiar to you. Communist Manifesto is designed by Karl Marx to bring about a state with centralized control of credit, transportation, communication, and the means of production, among other things. And as you may realize, all 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto are fully implemented today in the United States of America. Let's see if these things sound familiar as well. Plank 1 calls for abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. A property tax, which is state ownership of land. You never own your home. If you don't pay the tax, you lose the land, you lose your house. Plank 2 is the income tax, like we discussed earlier, a heavy, progressive, or graduated income tax. Plank 3 calls for abolition of all rights to inheritance. When you die, the government wants more. Or should I say, the banksters want more. Plank 4 mandates compensation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. We see people who try to fight the IRS system, like Peter Schiff's dad, end up in jail and get their property seized, and non-compliance is not tolerated. Plank 5 is the centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of the national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. That is the Federal Reserve System. The banks, the gangsters, the multi-corporate banking oligarchs. Plank 6 calls for the means of communication and transportation into the hands of the state, like the FCC and the Interstate Commerce Commission. Plank 7 empowers the state to control agriculture and production. Every year in America, farmers are paid millions of dollars not to produce. The bounty of the federal land is sold to special interests for pennies on a dollar. It reads extensions of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil, generally in accordance with a common plan. And with all the excessive regulation that Trump is trying to get rid of, the government controls how and what our factories produce. Plank 8 involves equal liability of all to labor, establishment of industrial armies, especially for our agriculture. And those armies would be considered the unions. Plank 9 dictates the combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equable distribution of the population over the country. How many farms are foreclosed on, and as we all know, they're trying to push us into coffin apartments, smart meters, control every aspect of your life, pack us into mega cities under the guise of environmental, global warming, global climate change, weather. Meanwhile, these gangsters and their minions set up the carbon taxes to tax what comes out of your mouth that plants need to breathe, telling us that polar bears are going to drown and Manhattan would be underwater by now, while buying up all the coastal line properties with their profits from this fraud. And Plank 10 is free education for all children in public schools. Abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production. So we see what the public school education has done to our children, running around with safe spaces and virtue signaling, and in a constant state of self-important victimhood, where everyone is told that even now college should be free, effectively diminishing the importance and value of having a college degree. And in most cases, these kids are coming out of school $60,000 in debt without any knowledge of how to use that education they just received to be a productive citizen, contribute to society, and have a viable future. People graduating college today are in for a very rude awakening, especially if they didn't focus on a science or a math or something really viable and needed by others. Professional protesters is what colleges are breeding today, using these communist or liberal professors, teaching them that this communist manifesto and communism is a great thing, when everywhere around the world, anytime socialism, communism has been tried, has failed. Venezuela, now they're eating their zoo animals. Soon will be resorting to cannibalism. It used to be said you're as rich as a Venezuelan, but as soon as socialism comes into a country, you eventually run out of other people's money, as Margaret Thatcher said. And communism is second only to Islam and the amount of people that have been killed under that regime. So I hope with Rachel Maddow pushing taxes to the front of the liberal diatribe, some people may be educated to the fact that we are slaves to an unelected group of banksters that control the Federal Reserve Bank and the printing presses of this country that routinely fail us every 10 years with some sort of crisis and plunge our great-great-great-grandchildren into more debt. And while everybody's running around virtue signaling and complaining about Trump and his taxes, we should really be worried about if we are going to survive the next crisis that these banksters are going to bring upon us. Because the Federal Reserve Bank is planning on accelerating interest rate hikes at a time when our economy is most vulnerable under Trump, because, as I said before, he understands these bankster gangsters. The Fed is private, which is the reason why he is a big fan of Andrew Jackson. So while the IRS collects fees for these banksters at gunpoint, and you are forced to pay for health insurance even though you don't want it, or you get fined, eventually this runaway debt will break the monotony, will have us atone for the decades and decades of ignorance we have shown the subject.
And you have meddled with the primal forces of nature. And you will atone.
Of debt and fiscal accountability. And sadly enough, these virtue signaling college kids will finally understand what Victor Hugo means when he says, adversity makes men, prosperity makes monsters. And my fear is that these kids are not ready for any sort of adversity, and they are being primed as cannon fodder for the inevitable and calculated destruction of our economy by multinational corporate banking families to usher in a one world government